Welcome. This is Darcy Peth with Ross Strategic, and this is the Innovative Financing Strategies for Reducing Nutrients webinar series. We'll wait just a minute here for everyone to get logged in, and then we will begin. Welcome. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Again, I am Darcy Peth with Ross Strategic. We are contractors to EPA, and this is a part of the Innovative Financing Strategies for Reducing Nutrients webinar series. The webinar series is co-hosted by USDA and EPA's Water Infrastructure and Resiliency Finance Center. Welcome to the webinar. We've got a full agenda for the next hour. We're going to do our welcome and agenda overview, a little bit about how you can participate in the webinar, an introduction to the webinar series, which is concluding with this webinar. We have 2 opening polls for you to participate in, and then we'll have our 2 featured presentations from Chad Prawl at Environmental Incentives and then Derek Wynn with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. We will have time for Q&A after each of these presentations, and time allowing, additional time at the end, and then we will adjourn at the top of the next hour. To participate in today's webinar, please click on the Q&A window in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. This will allow you to ask questions of the host and panelists. We will read your question aloud, time permitting, during the Q&A portion. If you have technical issues or questions about connecting to the webinar, you can click on the chat option in the toolbar, and that will send a chat message to the webinar host. Please don't type in content questions to the chat window because it's just a little easier for them to get lost in there. If you do type those into the Q&A window, we can make sure that they get moved up in the queue so that we can read them out loud. We do appreciate if you can spell out any acronyms and just make sure your question is as clear as possible for when it is read aloud to be understood. And as always, just want to note the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily reflect that of the federal government, and any mention of commercial enterprise products or publications does not necessarily mean that EPA or USDA endorses them. And I'm going to hand over to Tara Johnson at EPA to describe a little bit about this series that we are wrapping up with this webinar today.
Hi, thank you, Darcy. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon on our final webinar of the Nutrient Reduction Financing Series that we've been doing with USDA. We are talking about stormwater financing solutions, as Darcy mentioned today, and I want to especially thank Chad and Derek for agreeing to speak to us. If you have any questions afterwards, my email is up on the screen, waterfinancecenter@epa.gov. And we will be making this webinar available on our website at a later date. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I did just want to echo that because we do get that question a lot during these webinars. The webinar is being recorded. It will be posted with a captioned video on the EPA website within a couple of weeks, and we will also be posting a PDF that will be downloadable of the slides for today. So again, that will be available within a couple of weeks, and we'll be sending around an email at that time to let everyone know when it's ready. Okay, we have 2 opening polls now for everyone to participate in to let us know a little bit about you. First question, what type of organization are you from? So select the option that comes closest to describing you. I'm going to launch this poll now. And you can go ahead and select your option. I'll leave this open for just another moment. Okay. All right, thanks to everyone who voted. I'm going to share these results so you can see them. Looks like the majority of participants today are with state governments at 38%. And we then have 15% from local governments, excluding utilities, 12% from federal government, 14% NGOs, 6% from utilities, 1% ag, and 14% other. Okay. We have a second poll now. If you could describe your experience or familiarity with financing for nutrient reductions. So if you funded one or more nutrient reduction projects, you have some nutrient reduction initiatives that you're looking for funding or financing on. Nothing immediately that you need to fund, but you're interested to learn more. Familiar with potential financing opportunities, but would like to learn more, or no or very little experience or familiarity with the topic. So we, again, just select the option that best describes you. I'll leave this open for a few more seconds. Those of you who are still picking your option. Okay, I'll share these results. Looks like the majority, just about a third of you, are familiar with potential financing opportunities, but you would like to learn more. That's great. Then right behind that at 21%, no or very little experience or familiarity with the topic. Also glad to have people in that area. 18% have funded one or more nutrient reduction projects in the past. And 13% have nutrient reduction initiatives or projects and looking for additional funding or financing. So again, thank you for participating in the polls. Okay, we're going to transition into our featured presentations portion of the webinar. First up, we have Chad Prawl, is a founding partner of Environmental Incentives, LLC. He has focused his 20-year career on performance-driven approaches to conservation and wise use of financial resources. He finds flexible and financially efficient environmental strategies that reduce conflict between regulators and permittees. Chad's early experience monitoring water quality grounds him in practical realities that ensure programs do not become overly complex. Chad has earned 2 degrees from the University of California and is a professional engineer in California. Chad, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Darcy. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Darcy, can you go to the next slide, please? There we go. So as an overview of my presentation, I start with what I see as the challenge for stormwater program managers, and I think this will speak to local governments really well, hopefully to state governments too. I'll then go through a portfolio of strategies that I think can solve the challenge that I'm seeing, and then I'll introduce a couple of example strategies in detail, and then I'll pass the baton along to Derek, who will talk about some nutrient programs in Virginia. So next slide. The challenge that I see as I travel to watersheds basically across the country is there's this pull from regulators to achieve more performance in stormwater programs. They're asking managers to be accountable to numeric targets from TMDLs, to track progress, to show what projects they're doing. And I truly believe this is good for water quality. But the reality is that this is way more costly than stormwater programs used to be when they just had the 6 programmatic NPDES elements. So then there's this counter pull in the other direction from the local budget office to contain costs. And it's really challenging for a stormwater program manager to substantially increase the budget for this stormwater issue that's lower in public awareness than education, schools, healthcare, even transportation, you know, potholes on roads. That's a bigger deal. So it's a tough place for a stormwater program manager to be, where they have these increasing and high costs and high expectations, but then have real trouble funding what they're going to do. So I have seen 3 answers that I share with folks, and the next slide outlines those. Can you switch that, Darcy? So these three types of strategies to answer the challenge, and among those types, there's many strategies, but first is around funding and increasing the amount of funding and increasing the effectiveness of the funding that's there. And increasing dedicated budgets for stormwater is hard. I really think that's true, but there have been successes that are revealing best practices in that work. And I think a great example out west is in Los Angeles. They've recently passed Measure W that's now providing a substantial amount, it's $300 million a year for stormwater projects out there. And increasing the effectiveness of funding can be done by creating a performance management system. And that's really about having a defined unit of performance, also known as a credit, a stormwater credit. Examples of credits that are out there are around the amount of pollutant load reduction, the volume of water treated, that's what it is in Los Angeles County, and then, or also even just the impervious area treatment. But if you have a performance management system, you can maximize the amount of credits that you're getting and reduce that cost per unit over an ongoing time frame of a longer program. The second kind of strategies are around engaging partners to help implement projects. And that's about aligning the different objectives of different partners so they each contribute to each other's needs and leverage each other's budgets. And the examples I always cite of that are integrating stormwater projects with transportation, and that substantially reduces by 25 to 50% the cost of doing stormwater projects. Another example is that schools and parks can provide land or staff that can do maintenance and operations, and also that private property owners, you can offer them incentives, and that provides access to new land that local governments may not own, substantially changing the cost equation. And then the third type of strategy is around leveraging the private sector. And there are unique capabilities in the private sector. Partnerships and regulations can really make a change and make progress for stormwater. You can use streamlined contracting processes. You can manage project delivery risk, and you can find sources of financing in the private sector. And we're seeing that happen across the country. So, of those three types of strategies, there are lots of individuals strategies within those, and we organize those into a 2x2 matrix that we call the portfolio of funding and partnering strategies. Can you do the next slide, Darcy, please? And here's a look at that portfolio. And I'll just give you a chance to look at it and say that it's set up as a spectrum from on the left and on the bottom, things that are existing and pretty familiar to a lot of people. And then on the right and the top, things that are more new and innovative. And we have a lot of work showing people how those can benefit them. As you saw in that previous slide, there's these three sections. So I'll just go through each section. On the green side and the left, the familiar things at the bottom are grants and general fund budget. That's how most people are funding their stormwater programs for nutrient reduction. And then at the more innovative side of things are developer and in lieu fees, loan guarantees, things like that. On the bottom right, this blue area, there is regional projects, retrofit incentive, regional compliance programs, and regional projects. Those are pretty familiar. Folks out west are very familiar with, doing regional stormwater projects that collect water over a large area and treat it. And then on the right, there's more innovative things like tradable development rights, mitigation markets. On the upper right in red, here we're talking about those private sector things. I think most municipalities are familiar with bonds, various types, municipal, green. And then it goes all the way up to environmental impact bonds like those that are going on out in the mid-Atlantic, and mitigation markets. So just as a sidelight, most of the strategies in this matrix are either made possible by or substantially improved by having that credit, that stormwater credit, that defined unit of benefit. And that could be a load reduction of nutrients, it could be a volume of runoff treated, or it could be an area of land treated. But all of these things need a basis for good reporting, for doing trading, for doing alternative compliance, for setting up markets, for doing progress payments to private organizations. They all need this defined unit of benefit or credit. So that's my definition there. So the next part of my presentation just goes into the pay for performance contracting that you see in the upper right that's highlighted, and then another example of regional compliance programs. So next slide, Darcy. As far as pay for performance goes, I want to do a little contrast between typical project contracting and a pay for performance approach. And I should say that pay for performance is happening in several places, but I think Anne Arundel County is doing a great job with that out east and seeing some significant benefits, including accelerated time schedules for getting treatment of impervious acres done and reduced costs of projects. So if we go to the next slide, Darcy. Here's a look in a simplified diagram of a traditional project procurement approach. And there's a contract that specifies, hey, we're going to do a project over at a location, like we're going to do a project on First Street. And it says we're going to do it in these stages. There's an amount of activity that can be done, that needs to be done, and there are standards for quality. So the permittee would say, the stormwater permittee would say, establish that scope of work. There would be an implementer who would build the project, and then the permittee would review every month, every quarter, maybe even every week, and pay or reimburse the implementer for actions that are taken throughout implementation. And the result that we often see here are change orders that increase costs, and also construction challenges that reduce the number of benefits. Maybe there's a utility interference that says we can't do that nutrient basin here. We aren't going to be able to infiltrate because there's high groundwater. So reductions of benefits happen and costs go up with this traditional project procurement approach. To contrast that, next slide, Darcy, let's look at pay for performance. And here, the first stage is a contract that defines the terms for buying nutrient benefits, for buying nutrient reduction or acres of treatment. And that's what the contract is saying. It's not saying do this over on First Street or any particular area. It's just saying something like, we'll pay $20 a pound for nitrogen, or we'll pay $5 a pound for phosphorus. So you're paying for outcomes. And then the implementer takes on the project, takes the risk of implementing it, and then eventually reports the amount of load reduction that they're getting in the nutrients. And those are checked and reported. And then, next slide, please, Darcy. In the fourth step, either a third-party organization or maybe a regulator would certify those credits and verify that there is actual load reductions. And then at that point, the permittee pays based on the contract terms that they signed with the implementer and what they actually got. So you're only paying for the benefits you get. And I think this is very innovative but happening in several places around the country, and can happen at both a large scale, like some of the community-based public-private partnerships that we're seeing out east, but also at smaller scales on individual efforts and smaller programs. And we've seen some of that out in Washington and in Southern California out west. Performance contracts like this are really important in public-private partnerships because they define how and when the private partner should be paid. So that's my first example. Can we go to the next slide, Darcy? The second example strategy is around regional compliance programs. And really this is a flavor of trading programs. It's a slight difference on it. And the reason I talk about this flavor is because there have been many examples over the last 10, 15 years of trading programs that were so narrowly defined that there was not enough difference in cost within the trading area for trading to occur. You just couldn't find credits cheaper through one part of the trading area than in another part. That kept the number of transactions low, and that has really meant that the benefits of trading were not realized. EPA has seen that challenged, and this year issued a memo with 6 market-based principles, kind of expanding beyond trading programs to more market-based programs. And they issued that in February of this year, and expands the scope of trading into these 6 market-based principles. And that, I think, aligns really well with my company's take on what has been useful around trading, and that is the establishment of this defined unit of benefit, this credit, which can be used for many other strategies like that portfolio I showed a few slides ago to improve the return on investment for nutrient reduction projects. So one of these flavors of trading is these regional compliance programs, where it's not that folks are trading, but different jurisdictions are combining their efforts to combine with each other to achieve a watershed goal on a single body of water. And a good example of this is the Bi-State Sediment and Nutrient TMDL program that is in Lake Tahoe out in Nevada and California. So the first slide I have on this is around the permit progression. Next, Darcy. So there's 2 states around Lake Tahoe, and the California side has an NPDES permit. Nevada has a different form of regulatory approach. In 2005, there was a very standard permit with effluent concentration limits and the standard NPDES 6 programs checklist that everybody had to do. Let's see here, let me catch up on my notes. This caused a major problem for permittees, and the story here is that one permittee lead from a permittee told the regulator that she was going to quit her job before she was going to try to implement those concentration limits. And the result there was that permittees petitioned the permit, and there was really just a tough feeling amongst everybody involved at that time. 5 years later, there was a new type of permit, which was a credit-based approach with nutrient and sediment reduction requirements. And there, in that one, there was a 10% load reduction requirement, which was actually met and exceeded. And there was some challenge there in this program still, and there was still some grumbling from the permittees because the program was based around a paper handbook, and there was some databases, but they didn't work that well. But they did end up able to achieve the load reductions that were necessary by 2017. And I'll show you results of that in a minute. Then after 2017, there's been a new permit which has still credit-based, but now has an online tracking approach and has a requirement that has not been reached yet for 21% load reduction. And it does look like permittees are going to be able to achieve that in the 5-year permit term after 2017. So let me show you results here on the next slide of what the results were in 2016 and 2017. Oops, actually I'm a little out of order. I'll tell you a little bit more about the tracking system that we have now and use this as a way to summarize the program. On the top left picture here, you can see there's an inventory section. So permittees have built infrastructure for treatment. They've managed their roads and their other infrastructure to make sure that they're doing good water quality work to reduce nutrients and sediment. Then in the upper right, this assess box, every year permittees just do a drive-by, quick, rapid assessment of the infrastructure to see if it's working. And if it is, great, they don't do anything to it. If it needs some help, they do maintenance. And then in the lower right, this credits section of this homepage you're seeing, the regulators award credits annually if water quality is being maintained and the function of the infrastructure is up there. And then every 5 years, there are enhanced credit targets which increase the requirements for credits from all the permittees until they reach a 63% load reduction. And that's the amount that's estimated to be able to achieve the TMDL. So this is the online system and a little description of the program itself. Next slide is results. And here you can see that in 2017, the 4 permittees in California were able to exceed their number of registered credits. The same thing from the 3 permittees in Nevada. And you can see how all of their regional efforts add up to achieving that regional goal. And you can see that there's some exceedance of that goal. They actually required to get 10% load reduction. They hit 20, I'm sorry, they hit 12. And one of the things that is interesting here is the program, since they were achieving a little more than they needed to, the program doesn't use the term trade, but permittees can distribute their credits to other jurisdictions, allowing them to have contractual financial agreements with each other, or even just informal agreements that reduce costs overall and allow them to share costs. For instance, maybe a maybe Caltrans, our transportation road agency, will build the capital project, and then the local agency would maintain it. And then they're allowed to distribute credits between each other to decide who needs credits for their own compliance targets. Next slide, please, Darcy. So lessons learned here is that it was really important to have a cohesive system that added up everybody's results so they could see both their own contribution and the overall watershed benefits. And then having that system be administratively easy to use was essential. And that has really increased the satisfaction of the permittees in this permit because they know clearly what they have to do, what they're going to be enforced on or not. They get it done, they go home and sleep well at night. Second lesson learned is that the flexibility to voluntarily distribute credits. Yes, the tracking system knows where the credits go, they have to say that, but there's plenty of flexibility for the permittees to decide who's going to pay for what and how they're going to do it. And if somebody has more credits than they need in a year, they can send them to one of their partner jurisdictions. This is the element that is like trading, but not exactly. And then the third lesson learned is that this information on project condition is essential for both regulators to know that work is happened and is being maintained over time, and for the environmental NGOs to accept this distribution of credits and accept the program overall to make sure that there is a net environmental benefit and that that is maintained over time. And then the last thing, and probably the most striking thing that I have noticed, that there's a substantially better relationship among permittees and regulators. They don't spend time arguing over maximum extent practicable or difficult to achieve effluent limits. They work hard, they hit these increasingly tough credit targets, and then they go home knowing they've done a good job. And I see the permittees and the regulators having lunch together, having good relationships instead of arguing over it all the time. So there's a benefit here in this credit-based program of regional compliance. Next slide, please. So recall those 3 types of strategies. I often get asked when I'm traveling around, or I hear people say, well, yeah, trading only works over on the East Coast in Virginia, or these other types of programs only work over in these conditions in Lake Tahoe. And so I took a minute to put together a map. And if you could advance here, Darcy, one slide. I just took a minute to put together the programs that I'm quickly aware of and show that, just to show that where they're happening. And they're happening across the entire country. And there are these types of strategies going on all up and down the West and East Coast, up in the Great Lakes, and even in the center of the country. We're seeing these things take off. I'm really interested to receive ideas from those of you who are listening about other programs that are executing these strategies across the country, because I'd like this map to be even more complete. But it really is true that although there are some in this portfolio, there are some innovative things, they are beginning to be implemented and work across the company. And just to finish out, like I said, this pay for performance approach is working in Anne Arundel. It's working very well. They've done 3 rounds of RFPs for that over several years. And then this regional compliance program, which is akin to trading, but a little bit different and in line with EPA's new guidance from this year. It is happening, and I'd be happy to answer questions or be in contact with folks after this seminar. Oh, thank you for the reminder, Darcy. There are a couple of resources here at the end of the presentation that you'll get. There is a blog that we've posted around this portfolio funding and partnering strategies that you can read and pass along to folks who may need it. And then there's a pay for performance toolkit that we offer that was on a federally funded website through a federal grant to do research on how pay for performance can apply in stormwater and also in habitat conservation. I mentioned the Regional Compliance Program in Tahoe. There's the link to the website there. And then the new Water Quality Trading Policy Memo that EPA released in February with those 6 market-based principles. So great resources for you to check out. And like I say, I'm happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you so much for that great presentation. We have had a bunch of questions come in. I'm going to read some of those out loud during the next few minutes before we switch to our next presentation. So first one, regarding pay for performance. When there is not a market for a credit without third-party verification, how does someone determine the value of a credit to contract for?
So what you just need to do is start negotiations, and you know, you can have a reverse auction or put out an RFP. And Eric Michelson in Anne Arundel County, that's exactly what they did. They said, hey, our regulatory requirement is to treat a certain number of acres of impervious surface. And I've forgotten the number, but it's in the thousands of acres. And they're doing projects on their own, and they know what it costs the county to do their own projects. But they put out an RFP that said, hey, we'd like private parties or NGOs or anybody who can treat acres of impervious surface to make proposals to us and tell us what it's going to cost per acre for them to do it. And they saw a wide variety of costs, and they were able to choose the lowest cost that they felt was going to be verifiable. And they had, you know, contract conditions that are important to help them be sure that there was going to be regulatory approval of those credits. So the market can tell you if you put out an RFP, I guess is the short answer.
Great. Next question. So payment in lieu fees seem to always be less than necessary to cover all the costs, and governments sometimes have impediments to timely implementation of projects using payment in lieu. Can you cite any examples to the contrary?
This is a great question, and it's really true. It is a little bit of the potential dark side of in lieu fee programs. And I don't have a good example of an in lieu fee program that's working perfectly right now. But what I can say is it's important for a jurisdiction to protect itself from getting into that situation by, number one, recognizing that the full life cycle cost of the infrastructure that's going to be built in lieu is really important. And once that full lifetime cost is known, and you know, that's the fee reflects that, a lot of developers choose to just do the on-site project. So it's really a matter of doing an analysis that includes the full life cycle cost as opposed to the capital cost.
Okay. Next one's a bit of a long one, but there is a question at the end of it. This is, although the overall adoption of cover crops is less than 4% on our nation's croplands, Maryland farmers are leading the nation at planting cover crops. This has had significant impact on local water quality. Many of these farmers are increasing their soil health and farm profitability while mitigating nutrient runoff, drought, and flooding. These regenerative ag projects leverage the private sector and yield a financial ROI while also providing multifunctional CO benefits like cleaner water. Are there other private sector examples for funding nutrient reductions like this, especially with certified credits for nutrients or carbon sequestration?
Ooh, that is a mouthful. So examples other than agriculture where we can get lower costs?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, one of the things that is out there is around, I guess it's not private, but it would be around looking at water supply and treatment of water for water supply, and if there are ways to provide stormwater as a source there. And so infiltrating stormwater for water reuse is a big thing out in the West Coast. And there's an interesting study done in LA County in the last year or two showing that it's worth $1,100 per acre foot of water infiltrated to for water suppliers. And so water suppliers can benefit from the stormwater folks infiltrating water in their groundwater basins, and it is shown to be worthwhile to pay for. So that's one other example, and I'm sure there's more.
Great. We have had a bunch more questions come in. Unfortunately, for time, we're going to need to move on to our next presentation. As I mentioned before, the slides and the recording of the webinar will be available online later. The speaker's contact info is there, so if you're interested in following up over email to get another question answered, that will be a possibility. But thank you very much, Tad. For now, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Derek Wynn. Derek graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University with a master's in environmental studies, concentrating in non-point source water policy and GIS. He has over 10 years of experience working for the Commonwealth of Virginia, specializing in various NPS water quality programs, such as post-construction stormwater management, MS4 program development, TMDL implementation, and NPS grants. He has 5 years of experience in NPS trading, where he oversaw the NPS trading program expansion that took Virginia from having only 12 nutrient banks in 2014 to over 140 nutrient banks today, generating nearly 9,000 pounds of phosphorus reduction. I will hand it over to you, Derek.
Thanks, Darcy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm Derek Wynn, and I'm the non-point source trading coordinator for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. I would like to thank EPA and USDA for giving me this opportunity to share Virginia's non-point source trading program, and I hope to provide some insight into how other states and localities can start their own trading program. Next slide. So I'm going to give you a little overview of some of the topics I'm going to discuss today. First, I'm going to start off with nutrient trading terminology and Virginia DEQ roles and responsibilities. Then I'll move into Chesapeake Bay and the point source trading program briefly, to then move into non-point source trading, some of the water quality issues it addresses, the enacting policies, and the market driving permit, which is the Virginia Stormwater Management Permit. Then I will go into the status of non-point source trading and emerging markets within non-point source trading, some of the challenges we face with non-point source trading, and lastly, what it takes to start a non-point source trading program. Next slide. So I just wanted to start off with just addressing a little bit of the terminology, just to define it, to give you a better, clearer idea of what I mean when I use some of these terms. Essentially, in Virginia, a nutrient credit is measured in pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus reductions delivered to tidal waters of the Chesapeake Bay. Credits are generated by a project and may be transferred for the purpose of satisfying nitrogen and/or phosphorus reduction permit conditions off-site from a permitted activity. A nutrient bank is a project where at least one credit generating practice is implemented. Nitrogen and phosphorus credits are tracked separately and are not added together. You'd be surprised how many applications I saw where they add total pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus together to get a nutrient credit. Not sure where that idea came from, but anyways. Then wanted to explain kind of the difference between two different types of credits. One is term credits. Term credits are generated by practices that must be certified annually and can be used for 1 year of permit compliance. The next type of credit is perpetual credits, which are generated by permanent practices on deed restricted land and can be used to permanently satisfy pollution reduction requirements. Some of the roles and responsibilities that DEQ has include DEQ approves credit generating practices and certifies the generation of credits for individual nutrient banks. DEQ facilitates trades and credit sales by tracking credit transactions and providing a registry of available credits to the public. Some of the things DEQ does not do: we do not generate, sell, or broker credits, and we also do not set prices for nutrient credits. This is left for the free market to determine. Next slide. So I can't talk about nutrient and sediment pollution in the state of Virginia without at least first briefly discussing Chesapeake Bay watershed. It's a massive part of the state. It's a watershed that contains parts of 6 states and DC. It's a 64,000 square mile watershed, home to over 18 million people. Nutrient and sediment pollution has been causing eutrophication or algal blooms in the Chesapeake Bay, decline in oyster and blue crab fisheries, decline in submerged aquatic vegetation habitat, and also has been causing annual summer hypoxic conditions. If you look at the map on the right of the Chesapeake Bay, that area in red shows you all the areas where there is a dissolved oxygen level of virtually zero, which is detrimental to aquatic wildlife within the Chesapeake Bay. This area forms almost every year, and 2015 was a particularly bad year for the Chesapeake Bay. So Chesapeake Bay has been listed for impairments for dissolved oxygen and aquatic life, with nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment identified as the stressors for these impairments. And the Chesapeake Bay has been issued a total maximum daily load. I think it's one of the biggest in the country, if not the biggest in the country. Next slide. So the Chesapeake Bay TMDL really identifies 3 major sources for nutrient and sediment pollution in the bay. By far the biggest being agricultural runoff, next being urban stormwater runoff with wastewater treatment facilities not far behind it. You'll notice that there's air pollution significant load, and that specifically pertains to nitrogen, so from your NOx, and doesn't apply to sediment or phosphorus. And my next slide is going to focus on wastewater treatment, because that's really where trading begins in the point source sector. Next slide. So point source trading really started with the watershed general permit issued in 2007. It basically enacted a cap and trade program with point source to point source trading for existing facilities to meet an initial cap load. Point source to non-point source trading was reserved to accommodate new and expanding facilities, and this permit allows wastewater treatment plants to generate an annual term nutrient credit. Next slide. So the watershed general permit overlays individual NIFTI's permits and addresses nutrient loads in Chesapeake Bay watershed. NIFTI's waste load allocation limits are based on Bay TMDL implementation. This permit really allows wastewater treatment plants to work together with the most cost-effective upgrades being built by facilities that can provide credits to facilities with the least cost-effective upgrades to achieve a tributary-wide nutrient load reduction. Next slide. So really, non-point source trading policy-wise gets its start with the point source trading program, because in response to new and expanding facilities being able to purchase non-point source credits, trading guidance for agricultural landowners was published in 2008. This guidance establishes credit rates and pounds of reductions per acre of practice implemented for ag BMTs and land use conversions. The first nutrient bank in Virginia was approved in 2008, generating credits through agricultural land use conversion and reforestation. The nutrient bank conversion areas were deed restricted in perpetuity, prohibiting ag land use and development for perpetual credit generation. Lastly, the guidance also requires the implementation of baseline practices prior to credit generation. Next slide. So there's an agricultural baseline here in Virginia, and there's a baseline for all practices, but essentially there are 5 practices that have to be in place before an agricultural tract can start generating credit. And those practices include a soil conservation plan, a nutrient management plan, cover crops, livestock exclusion fencing, and a 35-foot riparian buffer. Once these practices are implemented, a agricultural piece of land can then generate credits through practices such as continuous no-till, a 15% reduction in nitrogen on corn, early planted cover crops, and also on land conversion. All practices generate annual term credit, but land conversion can generate perpetual credits because it's a deed-restricted practice. This is essentially a Virginia strategy for incentivizing unregulated agricultural nutrient reductions through trading. Baseline requirements also have another benefit by creating a level playing field and it prevents the worst land stewards from generating the most credit. And also, implementing a baseline also generates additional non-tradable nutrient reductions, providing a net uplift to the watershed. So it's really not just a trade of 1 pound from a credit generating entity to a permit holder. So it's not just a pound for pound. You're getting additional reductions through the implementation of baseline. Next slide. So today, there really haven't been any non-point source to point source trades in Virginia, and there are really several reasons why that's the case. And one of them is expanding wastewater treatment plants were able to upgrade and stay under their load cap. Adequate credits were available from other point sources. Another reason is there's a 2-to-1 uncertainty ratio applied to non-point source to point source trades. This is mainly due to point sources having a much better handle on what they're discharging and what they've reduced versus the estimated nutrient reductions of agricultural BMP. And the main issue is it's a problem of scale. It takes a lot of land just to generate the amount of nutrient credits a wastewater treatment facility would need. For example, it would take 2,000 acres of early planted cover crop to generate 500 pounds of nitrogen reduction, which is enough credit to offset one 10,000 gallon per day facility operating at 8 milligrams per liter of nitrogen. And overall, ag BMPs are just expensive compared to the cost of point source credits. So really, at this point, non-point source trading lacks a smaller scale water quality issue and permit driving market, which leads me to the next slide. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of the impacts of stormwater runoff on water quality and nutrient loading, but I would like to say that stormwater management is has more of a scale that's suited to nutrient trading than point source wastewater treatment sector. Next slide. And I'm going to go ahead and skip this next slide as well for the sake of time. So we have this issue with stormwater management in the state of Virginia, and we addressed that issue with the Stormwater Management Program, which was enacted in 2004. The permit went into effect requiring post-construction stormwater quality and quantity criteria statewide. The permit is required for construction activities 1 acre or greater. It identifies phosphorus as a keystone pollutant, which is used as a surrogate for nitrogen and sediment. And the permit requires post-construction stormwater runoff not exceed phosphorus loads greater than 0.41 pounds per acre per year. Next slide. So really, with the Stormwater Management Program, the enacting policy for non-point source trading was an amendment to the Virginia Stormwater Management Act, which went into effect in 2009, adding provisions for nutrient credit trading. These provisions allow permittees to meet post-construction water quality criteria with the purchase of perpetual non-point source phosphorus credits generated by permanent practices such as land use conversion, stream restoration, and urban stormwater BMPs. Associated nitrogen credit must be retired for all VSMP phosphorus purchases. Nutrient banks and construction activities must be in the same or adjacent 8-digit HUC within the same tributary in order for them to trade. And also, localities have the ability to restrict trading based on water quality impairment and for the protection of sensitive waters such as drinking water reservoirs. All water quantity requirements that are required in the VSMP program must be treated on site. So there's no volume trading in Virginia at this time. And lastly, the use of state and federal water quality grants is prohibited for the generation of non-point source credits. Essentially, this is all supposed to be private sector invested, and it's a system that works pretty well overall. One thing that can be funded for nutrient banks is baseline implementation. So those baseline practices that are required before the generation of a credit can be grant funded. Next slide. So now that we have a market within the Virginia Stormwater Management Program, we have a pretty active market today with over 140 nutrient banks, all permanent practices generating perpetual credits, which is required under the VSMP program. So to date, we've had a generation of a total of 8,800 pounds of phosphorus, and 4,900 of those pounds have been sold. Average cost per pound varies by watershed. It could be anywhere from 8,500 to 22,500, but on average, I'd say it's probably about 12,500 statewide. And these prices are driven by on-site treatment costs, nutrient bank land value, and bank competition within a trading tributary. There have been thousands of trades over the life of the program, ranging anywhere from 1/100 of a pound to 100 pounds. Total annual market value is about $15 million. And on the right there, you'll see a graph that really just tracks the generation of phosphorus credits and the sale of phosphorus credits from 2013 to 2018. You can see that the program's really been ramping up over the last 6 years. Next slide. I'm not going to spend too much on this slide. This is just to kind of give you an idea of where all the banks are in the state of Virginia and what the major tributaries are in Virginia. All the little black dots are where nutrient banks are located. And the map on the left indicates where all the major development areas in the state of Virginia are. And you can see that a lot of these nutrient banks are pretty much placed on the outskirts of these development areas. So really those development areas are kind of driving where these nutrient banks are located. Next slide. So other than the VSMP program, there are other markets that are emerging right now in Virginia due to 2012 legislation, which allows MS4 and industrial stormwater permittees to purchase non-point source nutrient credits. These credits can be utilized for meeting Chesapeake Bay TMDL load reduction permit requirements under their MS4 and industrial stormwater permits. And they need to meet load reductions for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So they aren't just interested in phosphorus like the VSMP program. Only a few MS4 purchases have been made to date by the Virginia Department of Transportation's MS4, but I imagine that sales record is probably going to pick up once we start ratcheting down on total load reductions required, and this is pretty much taking effect over 3 permit cycles. And we'll probably see a lot more activity from the MS4s in the last permit cycle. Lastly, I also just wanted to mention in 2016, legislation was passed that allowed nutrient banks to generate sediment credits for sales to MS4s. So there's also another market that's emerging within sediment credits. Next slide. All right, so this slide really just shows you a side-by-side comparison of point source and non-point source trading. I mean, they really do operate as separate programs, and there's some policy overlap, but in effect, they have not overlapped to date because there have been no non-point source to point source trades. So for the point source trading program, it's a traditional cap and trade program. And the scale of trading is in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, which is quite a bit more than the non-point source side. Number of annual trades is only in the teens, and the credit type is an annual term credit. And the trades are limited to the major tributaries. And this program is really only in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And the total market value is $1.5 million annually. The regulatory drivers of point source trading are the Bay TMDL and the NIFTY's individual permit. And the active permit market is really being facilitated by the watershed general permit. And there is an emerging market with point source trading within the MS4 sector, which can also use point source credits. So in the non-point source trading program, really it kind of mimics the mitigation banking model for trading. The scale of annual trading is 1,200 pounds, and the number of trades is approximately 1,000 per year. Credit type is perpetual, and the trades are limited by tributary and also by same and adjacent 8-digit hydrologic unit, and also based on local water quality-based limitations, which really depends on the locality. This program is implemented statewide, and the annual market is about $15 million. The regulatory drivers right now for it are the post-construction stormwater management, or the VSMP program, and the active permit market is also VSMP. But there are emerging markets with MS4 and industrial stormwater permits as well. I foresee some interest in non-point source trading versus point source trading for the MS4s, mainly because once you buy a perpetual credit, you don't have to worry about renewing and buying credits on an annual basis. You can just buy that perpetual credit and you'll be in compliance, for the life cycle of your permit. Next slide. The non-point source trading challenges. One thing that we've kind of failed to do is incentivize ag DMP implementation for term nutrient credit generation. Virginia has yet to find a market for term non-point source credits. We've also had issues with credit tracking growing pains. Virginia is currently tracking credit generation from 140 nutrient banks with thousands of sales and an Excel spreadsheet for a registry at this time. we'll be upgrading to the Ribbits platform, which is currently being used for mitigation banking nationwide. Now, I would just like to give a special thanks to USDA for providing a grant that allows us to make this upgrade to the Ribbits platform, and I would also like to thank the Army Corps of Engineers for hosting us on the Ribbits platform. Another issue we've had is continuing programmatic development within an existing trading market that may oppose change. I mean, it's kind of the, well, we've got this system that works great, why change it? And this has really been indicated in the draft non-point source credit certification regulations have had several areas of contention expressed by the banking community in recent public comment periods. Some of these issues include baseline requirements, local water quality provisions, and credit release schedules. And lastly, one issue we've been having is updating land conversion credit rates using the latest Chesapeake Bay model to establish sediment reduction rates, to provide sediment credits to the MS4s. An unintentional consequence of this is by using the latest available science, we're seeing credit rates generally go down from land conversion practices, which is a cause for concern amongst the non-point source banking community. Next slide. So lastly, what does it take to establish a non-point source trading program within a state or a locality? I mean, the take-home message here is it requires a regulatory driver. If you don't have a regulatory driver that facilitates trading, you're going to have a program that just kind of sits on the shelf. So by regulatory driver, I mean, enacting policies that allow or encourage trading, permits that require numeric nutrient reduction, and permit flexibility that allows trading to meet reduction requirements. It also takes addressing water quality issue with the appropriate scale for non-point source trading. Will the credit generation match the credit demand cost effectively? It also takes establishment of a baseline to generate reductions beyond what is tradable to see a net uplift within the whole watershed instead of just a credit for credit transaction. And it also takes allowing credits to be generated in a sector less regulated where cheaper reductions can be achieved, i.e. Agriculture. And lastly, it takes private sector investment in cost-effective nutrient reduction practices that can be profitable to bank sponsors and marketable to permit holders for satisfying water quality criteria. So these are the factors that have led non-point source trading to be an effective tool for achieving cost-effective nutrient reductions from multiple pollution source sectors in Virginia. And that leads me to my next slide. And I'd just like to open it up for questions. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Derek, for an informative presentation. We've had a bunch of questions come in. We only have a couple minutes left to get to a few of them. Derek's email address is up there on the screen. If you have a question that we don't have a chance to get to, you can email it to Derek after the call to continue to coordinate, to continue the conversation. Okay, first question. Is there a party that's responsible for field verification of the permanent practices, and how frequently are the practices verified under the stormwater trading program?
So in Virginia, it's actually, that's another one of DEQ's roles and responsibility. We also handle verification of these credit generating practices. Now, in most cases in Virginia, we're talking land conversion is the most common practice that's being implemented. So we usually try to get out there annually, particularly in the first 3 years of a reforestation project, because that's the most critical time for tree plantings. But yeah, so it's DEQ that's responsible. We don't use a third party for verification at this time.
Is there any way the public can view the free market dollar value of NNP credits?
At this time, no. We've set up a registry which allows anybody interested in purchasing credits to contact and ask for pricing and availability from any of the nutrient banks that can service their construction activity. So there really isn't a listing of prices, although in some cases I can give people an average value I've been seeing just based off of the 6% fee that we implement. But yeah, generally no, that's not something that we publish.
What is the least expensive and or most effective BMP you have seen for nutrient reductions in Virginia?
So on the non-point source side, it's land use conversion. It's really been the most cost effective and kind of the low hanging fruit at this time. And, you know, really the way I see it is land conversion is kind of like it's always trending toward, you know, a new piece of land alone in the state of Virginia, it's going to return to forest. So it's always trending towards that state that generates credit versus something like say a stream restoration or urban stormwater VMP, which has, you know, maintenance requirements that would have to be implemented periodically. So that's been the most common you know, method for generating a nutrient credit. You know, I think long term the program is going to have to evolve beyond just land use conversion because we can't convert all our ag land in perpetuity.
How do NPS trading results compare to the reductions required by TMDL?
Trading results we'll say most of it's been for the Virginia Stormwater Management Program, which has not really been TMDL related. We will be seeing more trades with the MS4 sector purchasing credits specifically for TMDL compliance. So we haven't seen a whole lot of that yet, besides from the Virginia Department of Transportation, which has made a couple large-scale trades fairly recently for permit compliance under the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. So really, the VSMP, I was just going to say the VSMP program is really just for local water quality. It's not really TMDL driven necessarily. Although the reductions achieved by baseline, you know, can show improvement in the Bay watershed.
Great. And unfortunately, last question we're going to have time for today. So far, Virginia has required lands to be retired to allow credits for trading. Is there any progress being made on term credits or extended contract credits so it is not just retiring land from production?
So there is the capability of land conversion practices generating a term credit. Essentially, you know, these practices are allowed to sell term credits, and essentially that would just be them selling a term credit, and then, you know, once that term has expired, that credit would essentially return to their ledger. But yeah, I haven't seen a whole lot of that.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for the questions, and thanks Derek for replies. Again, if you still have questions that you'd like to converse with Derek on, email address is there. And again, the recording and PDF of slides will be posted online within a couple of weeks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much. And again, thanks to both of our speakers. On behalf of USDA and EPA, we appreciate everyone's participation in this webinar. And this will conclude the 4-part webinar series. So thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.